Well, as always, thank you for joining me in this study through the book of Revelation. I'm Randy Duncan, and in this episode, we're going to be covering chapter 7. Now, in this chapter, we're getting a little bit of what we need here, a sort of a chance to catch our breath after the last episode, which included the four horsemen of the apocalypse and other catastrophes for people on the earth as the day of the Lord is at hand. I mean, we even mentioned the possible collapse of space-time in the last episode, so this one's coming at a good time. Now, as a reminder, we're now seeing Jesus break open the 7 seals of the scroll, and in the last episode, he broke 6 of those. And so this chapter will serve as a sort of a pause in that action before he opens the 7th seal in the next chapter. Now, many scholars take this chapter 7 as, again, a sort of an intermission between the 6th and 7th seals. When we get there, we'll actually see the same sort of thing with the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets series. From a literary perspective, this serves to sort of build suspense in the narrative, but in the midst of such suffering and judgment, it also serves to provide a sense of hope and encouragement to God's people. But I also want to remind you of the last verse in the last chapter, and actually, let me just read the last 2 verses from chapter 6. We ended by John describing events at the end of time when Jesus would return and punish evil, and all men would flee. And remember, he described for us in verses 16 and 17 that they would be calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" So the last chapter ended with a question. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Well, this chapter will provide an answer to that question. But before we get to that, let's begin with the first 3 verses where John says, "And after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, with the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.'" And so John sees 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the winds. Now, skeptics and non-believers, they will sometimes point out that the phrase 4 corners of the earth suggests a flat or a square earth, which contradicts the modern scientific understanding that the earth is a spherical globe. I mean, a spherical object doesn't have corners, so they argue that this reflects some sort of an outdated or pre-scientific cosmology. They see this as evidence that the Bible contains these ancient, pre-scientific beliefs rather than divine truth. And so a skeptic might say, look, if the Bible was truly divinely inspired with accurate knowledge, it wouldn't use language implying a flat earth, which we know is false based on evidence from astronomy and geology. However, the phrase 4 corners of the earth, it doesn't imply literal flat earth, but it functions as an idiom, a figure of speech, kind of like we might say, "I'll hunt you down to the ends of the earth," meaning everywhere or the whole earth. It doesn't mean I believe that there's an actual end of the earth or that I'll hit a wall at the end or fall off the edge. Scripture frequently uses expressions like this to convey completeness or the universal nature of something. So, for example, in Isaiah 11:12, God promises to gather his people from the 4 corners of the earth, clearly meaning from all directions or regions, not literal corners. And Ezekiel 7:2 speaks of the 4 corners of the land to emphasize the totality of judgment across all of Israel. And remember, Revelation belongs to the genre of apocalyptic literature like Daniel or parts of Ezekiel, which uses vivid, symbolic imagery to reveal spiritual realities. It's not always trying to provide us with an actual physical blueprint. And just as a side note, about 700 years before John wrote Revelation, people already knew that the earth was a sphere. This was well known by the ancient Greeks. I mean, they knew from observing lunar eclipses and constellations, and even from watching ships coming and going over the horizon. And so the point is that John also knew that the earth was spherical, not flat or square. And so when we read here in verse 1, the four corners, that's not a scientific statement about the shape of the earth, but rather a figure of speech symbolizing the entirety of creation under God's sovereign control. The angels stationed there illustrate his authority over every part of the world. And so it's a mistake for anybody to insist or argue that the Bible is mistaken here. But the angels are stationed here so that the four winds don't blow on the land or the sea or the trees. In other words, they're restraining judgment because the winds will bring destruction. Now this description, the four winds, signifies the judgment that's to come. And we see it in Jeremiah chapter 49 where God tells the prophet what he will do to the ancient civilization of Elam. And he says, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, and I will bring upon Elam the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. And I will scatter them to all those winds. I will terrify Elam before their enemies and before those who seek their life. I will bring disaster upon them. My fierce anger, declares the Lord. I will send the sword after them until I have consumed them." And here, in the apocalypse, these angels prevent these winds, these judgments, from blowing in until God allows it. These angels are God's ministers who carry out his will. And I would add that there are some who believe that the four winds is actually a reference to the four horsemen of the apocalypse that we covered in the last episode. They point to Zechariah chapter 6 where we also see a vision of four horsemen. But regardless, the important thing here is that these angels of God are temporarily holding back and preventing the coming destruction. But John continued in verse 2, remember, by saying, "Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God. And he called with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." Now this other angel from the east bears the seal of the living God. The seal the angel bears signifies one who is protected and authenticated, that one belongs to God. And this angel calls out to the other four angels who have authority over the land, sea, and trees, and they're restrained by this angel from bringing any further destruction. Again, the destruction they're about to bring must be delayed, but why? And for how long? Well, we don't have to wonder because we're told, until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. This sealing of those who belong to God will protect them from the coming wrath and destruction. Now, there's a lot of debate and speculation about the nature of this seal or this mark. Some people interpret the seal as some sort of a visible, physical mark placed on the foreheads of God's servants, something like maybe like a tattoo or a brand or some other physical marking. They argue that it's a physical mark because the text specifies on their foreheads, which suggests an actual tangible location. And this has a parallel with Revelation 13, where the mark of the beast is a physical mark on the forehead or hand. And so this sort of implies a contrasting literal seal or mark for God's people, and that Satan once again will try to mimic God with his own seal, the infamous mark of the beast that we'll see later on. But others view this seal or this mark as being more spiritual in nature, and that it's invisible, at least to humans. They view the seal as a spiritual designation rather than a physical mark, symbolizing God's ownership or protection of his servants. Ephesians 1 tells us that believers are sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, which suggests a spiritual marking of God's people. And in 2 Corinthians 1:22, God set his seal of ownership on us, reinforcing the idea of an invisible divine claim. And so for those who don't think the seal or the mark is anything physical, they believe that the seal represents God's internal spiritual protection of believers, distinguishing them from the world in a way that's visible only to him and his angels. Now, I'll mention a couple of things that I think are interesting here. First, remember when Cain murdered Abel and God banished him from the land? What was Cain's response? In Genesis 4, Cain says to God, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But do you remember God's response to Cain? God said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. God put a mark on Cain to protect him. And just like the mark or seal that we're discussing here, was it a physical mark like a tattoo or a scar or maybe even some other divine symbol, or was it something else? Some people have even suggested it was a cross. The other thing I wanted to mention is the marking of the blood on the doorpost in Exodus 12 during the Passover. Now this one was obviously a physical mark, as the Jews spread blood over the doorpost to protect them from the death angel who would kill all the firstborn in Egypt, but would pass over those who had the blood over the doorpost. This was a sign, a mark, that those people were protected by God. Now, I've mentioned the rapture a couple of times in Revelation so far, and I'm sure I will again, but I want to point out here a couple of examples that some people use as arguments against an actual rapture of the church. They argue that this sealing or marking of God's people prior to the coming destruction and wrath protects them during the wrath, but it doesn't remove them from being in the midst of the destruction. God didn't remove the Jews while the death angel passed over Egypt, but he protected them in the midst of it. Once the wrath had passed, only then did God lead them to the promised land. And we see here in Revelation that the angel calls out to the other 4 angels to pause while the people of God can be sealed. If believers were going to be raptured out of the tribulation and destruction, then why would they need to be sealed or marked for protection during the coming destruction? Now, as I said before, that's not something that we're going to settle right here, but I just want you to be aware of different perspectives. Now, getting back to the text here, regardless of whether this mark is physical or spiritual, the more important point is that the purpose is to shield believers during the divine judgment and wrath that's coming. The seal is God's guarantee that his servants belong to him and are preserved through tribulation, whether that's physical or spiritual in nature. But this seal somehow distinguishes God's followers from others during the apocalyptic judgments, and so it ensures their safety when the angels are cleared to unleash destruction. But we continue now with verses 4 through 8 as John says, "And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. 12,000 from the tribe of Judah were sealed, 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 from the tribe of Gad." And he goes on and says there's 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. I'll just spare you from reading all that. But John hears the number of people who were sealed, and it was 144,000. Again, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I want to spend a few minutes taking a closer look at this because this is a topic with a few different views, and so I want to provide you with some background and insight. Because the identity of the 144,000 sealed here in Revelation 7 has been a subject of a lot of interpretation and debate among biblical scholars, theologians, and even different Christian denominations. And basically, the debate comes down to this. Some believe the 144,000 are literal Jewish believers saved during the tribulation, while others see them as symbolic of all Christians. Now, I'm not going to get into a deep eschatological or dispensational discussion here, but the controversy over the 144,000 reflects the differing theological perspectives that people have on Israel and the church. In other words, does God have a different plan and treat Israel and the church differently? Or is Israel treated as being a part of the church? And so, before I go any further in trying to lay this out, I want to go ahead and read verse 9 because I also want to reference it in this discussion. But John also says in verse 9, "And after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands." And so with that in mind, let's take a look at a couple of different interpretations and perspectives on the 144,000 people who were sealed. And although there are nuanced versions of each, there are basically 2 approaches you can take here. You can take a more literal interpretation, or you can take a symbolic interpretation. And although I won't be able to do justice to either side in this quick of a summary, let me at least lay out the basics of each. But to give you some context, The controversy centers on the nature of Israel in the New Testament and whether it refers to ethnic Jews or the church as a whole, and the timing of events like the Great Tribulation and the Rapture, if there is such a thing. So let me start with a literal interpretation and give you the main points of that perspective. This literal interpretation stems primarily from what's called a dispensational theology. Now again, I don't want to get bogged down here, but I think it's important that you understand the line of thinking. Dispensational theology is just a theological system that interprets biblical history as a series of these distinct periods of time or dispensations in which God interacts with humanity differently, maintaining a clear distinction between Israel as his earthly people with national promises and the church as his spiritual people with heavenly promises. And so for dispensationalists, they maintain a separation in how God deals with the church and how he deals with Israel. And so with that in mind, they take a literal interpretation of the 144,000, believing that they are literal Jewish believers who will be saved and sealed for protection during the end times tribulation. In defense of their view, they point to the Bible's specific mention of all the tribes of Israel and the listing of 12,000 from each tribe that we just read. And so they argue that this suggests a literal ethnic identification. The 144,000 are protected on earth during the tribulation, possibly even serving as evangelists, leading to the salvation of the great multitude that we read about in verse 9. They interpret these people as Gentiles saved during this period. And so again, this view maintains a distinction between Israel and the church, with the church raptured before the tribulation and the 144,000 representing a separate group of Jewish witnesses. So that was the literal view. Now let's take a look at the symbolic view. Many non-dispensationalist scholars argue that the 144,000 represent the entire community of redeemed believers, both Jews and Gentiles, symbolizing the completeness of God's people. In defense of their view, here are a couple of their arguments. First, the number 144,000, 12 times 12 times 1,000, emphasizes perfection and completeness, which aligns with Revelation's symbolic use of numbers. For instance, the term thousand, it's used 19 times in Revelation, often symbolically and not literally. The great multitude that we see here in Revelation is described as being from every nation, tribe, people, and language. And so it's seen by some as simply another depiction of the same group, just emphasizing their diversity and their heavenly state after the tribulation, supporting the idea that the 144,000 and the great multitude are the same symbolic group of people, just viewed from two different perspectives. This interpretation argues that the 144,000 people sealed in Revelation 7 are most likely a symbolic representation of all God's redeemed people, including both Jews and Gentiles who have faith in Christ. And so this interpretation views the number as a way to show the completeness and the perfection of God's people, with 144,000, again, equaling 12, which is a biblical number for completeness, times 12,000 times 1,000, which is simply a large, complete number. And so this structure suggests a symbolic rather than a literal interpretation, especially, again, if you consider Revelation's apocalyptic genre, which frequently uses numbers symbolically. And so this means it's not about a literal count of 144,000 individuals, but rather the completeness and the fullness of those who were saved. And they also point to verse 9, where we read about the great multitude of people that no one could number, described as being from every nation, tribe, people, and language, emphasizing again their diversity and just their vast number. And so in short, the symbolic interpretation argues that the 144,000 are not a literal count, but a way to illustrate the fullness of God's redemptive plan, with the listing of the 12 tribes simply symbolizing the spiritual heritage of all believers. Now, before I leave the topic of the 144,000, there may be those of you listening who wonder about the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they deal with the 144,000. Well, real briefly, prior to 1935, they believed the 144,000 was the literal number of people who were going to be saved and go to heaven. Before 1935, their publications like The Watchtower stated that only the, quote, spirit-begotten ones, referring to the 144,000, would be saved. But in 1935, at a convention in Washington, D.C., they introduced the, quote, great crowd as a separate class of saved people who would live forever on earth. And so, although they haven't changed the number of 144,000 who will go to heaven, they have had a major change in their belief about the total number of people who will be saved. What's interesting is that this change came as their membership grew, leading to confusion about who could be a part of the 144,000 in heaven, which then prompted this distinction to account for the increasing number of Jehovah's Witnesses. But let's pick back up with the text beginning in verse 9, which reads, "And after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes and palm branches in their hands, and crying with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.' And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, 'Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen.'" And so we read here for the second time, verse 9, where John looks and sees a great multitude that no one could number, from all tribes, languages, and peoples. But notice one thing here. When he's describing this time, he says he looked and saw this multitude. The first time, which he describes in verses 1 through 8, and you may not have caught this, he only heard the multitude. In other words, Revelation is drawing an explicit contrast between these two groups of people. John heard the first number and saw the second group. And this is interesting because if you remember from chapter 5, John first heard the lion, and then he turned to see the lamb. This is a point made by some people to argue that these two groups of people are one and the same group, and they represent all believers, but they're simply being viewed from two different perspectives, with verses 1 through 8 referencing an earthly experience, while verses 9 through 17 transitions to a heavenly scene. But the first group was numbered, 144,000. The second group, no one could count. The first group was Jewish, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. The second group was from every nation. And that this number of people was uncountable reflects fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham that all people would be blessed through him. And as some people have pointed out, the first group that John heard was being prepared to withstand imminent persecution. The second group is victorious and they're secure in heaven. In other words, they would argue that, again, these visions refer to the same group of people and they're distinguished only by their location. The 144,000 are about to enter into a period of this intense secular oppression and persecution. The second vision is to bring encouragement to believers by revealing what awaits them in heaven. But John says that they were standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes. And the white robes are appropriate for worship, but they also reflect the clothing of victors, the ones who have overcome that Jesus referred to in chapter 3, and they've been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb. And so, even though it's a description of believers and what they're wearing, the focus of the image should actually be the effects of Christ's sacrifice on their behalf. Because without Christ's sacrifice, none of us are going to be wearing white robes, let alone standing in heaven before God's throne. And so it's important for all of us to be reminded that salvation is a divine act. It's not a human achievement. But the believers are not just standing in silence before God's throne. They're crying out with a loud voice, along with all the angels and the elders and the four living creatures, falling on their faces before the throne and worshiping God. And I'm sure it's an almost indescribable heavenly chorus. I mean, you know when sometimes you hear a song and something about it just touches your soul? I mean, can you imagine what this is going to be like? And in their worship of God, and I know we've mentioned this in an earlier chapter, but notice, They lift up words of adoration and praise. 7 characteristics or descriptions of God, with 7 being the number of perfection, underscoring the perfection of God's attributes. And count them if you want, because they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, and count these, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. But John continues in verses 13 and 14, saying, Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, Who are these, clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? And I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now this conversation occurs right after John's vision of the vast multitude worshiping before the throne. One of the 24 elders, which we've discussed the possible identity of already in a previous episode, initiates a dialogue with John. But when the elder asks John this question, he doesn't expect an answer. This sort of a question is a normal and accepted pedagogic technique of the culture of that day. Now, a pedagogic technique of asking rhetorical questions is a teaching strategy where the teacher asks questions to students not to receive direct answers, but to stimulate thought or to emphasize a point or maybe to guide learners toward a deeper understanding. And so these questions are normally framed in a way that assumes the answer is obvious, and it's meant to encourage reflection rather than an actual verbal response. And so, for example, after Adam sins and tries to hide from God, God calls out to Adam, Where are you? After Cain murders Abel, God asks Cain, Where's your brother Abel? And in Job, when God asked Job, Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? God already knew the answers to these questions. He wasn't looking for an answer. He was seeking to help each of these people think more deeply about the situation. And so the elder's question here, who are they and where did they come from, seems rhetorical. And that's why John's response, Sir, you know, it makes sense. He knows the elder already knows the answer to the question. It's a rhetorical question, simply meant to stimulate thought and provide a deeper understanding. Now, the identity of the great multitude of people has sparked a lot of debate, and we've already touched on that, so I'm not going to belabor that discussion. But when we first began this study, I mentioned there are various views that people take of the book of Revelation. I mentioned the futurist view, the historical view, and the symbolic view. The elder reveals that these are people who have come out of the Great Tribulation. And the phrase, Great Tribulation, has sparked a lot of debate, and depending on how you view Revelation, it will color your interpretations of things like this. So, for example, if you subscribe to a futurist view, you'll probably see the Great Tribulation as a specific 7-year period of great turmoil, with this multitude being those saved or martyred during that time. If you take more of a historical view, then you might see this as representing the persecutions under Roman emperors like Nero or Domitian, suggesting that the multitude represents early Christian martyrs. And if you take a symbolic view of Revelation, you might see it as an ongoing reality, as believers of all eras who overcome spiritual and physical trials through faith in Christ. But regardless of how you view it, these verses connect the dots between earthly struggle and heavenly triumph. The great multitude's journey through tribulation to standing before the throne mirrors this broader narrative of Revelation, that chaos and pain are not the end. They lead to restoration for those who have placed their faith and trust in Jesus. But we wrap up this discussion with the last 3 verses, which have brought comfort to countless millions of people who have suffered in this life. Beginning with verse 15, we read, Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now these verses follow the elders' explanation that the multitude in white robes came out of the great tribulation and washed their robes in the Lamb's blood. And so they link the people's past suffering to their present and future reality in God's presence. These verses shift from the triumphant worship scene that we just read about to a description of God's care, sort of rounding out this vision before the seventh seal is opened in the next chapter and we resume the plagues and tribulation. Now, when it says that God will shelter them with His presence, it literally means spread His tabernacle over them. And it reminds us of the tabernacle in the wilderness. The tabernacle erected by Israel in the Old Testament anticipated God's presence with His people forever, where He'll dwell with us in a much deeper and a much more profound way. And verse 16 lists what the multitude will never again experience: hunger, thirst, scorching sun or heat. And these echo the hardships of tribulation, famine, dehydration, exposure, and it all recalls Israel's wilderness wanderings and the plagues in Revelation. These verses promise a complete reversal of their past struggles to a state of perfect provision and comfort. And when it says, "They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more," remember what Jesus told us: "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." And the final image of the chapter, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, is pretty profound. After all the suffering and tribulation and hurt we experience in life, our tears are not just ended, they're erased by a divine touch. The last 3 verses are a reminder that God doesn't just save us from something, but to something, which is eternal joy in His presence. Augustine said that God made us for Himself, and we only truly rest when we rest in Him. And when we get to this point, the days of suffering will have ended. The days of reward have begun. And this is a picture of the security and the joy and abundance that believers will enjoy in heaven. All the suffering, all of the pains of life on earth are over. There's a verse in a song I like that says, "The wounds this world left on my soul will all be healed and I'll be home." And remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2, that no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love Him. But I do know this: whatever else I may not be able to imagine, I look forward to the removing of all the hurt, all the suffering, all the pain that is a part of this life, and that I'll be home, and all my tears will be wiped away.
Don't matter where